Maplewood Estates looked like the kind of neighborhood people dreamed about from the outside. Clean sidewalks, evenly cut hedges, freshly painted fences, and mailboxes aligned with military precision. Every lawn seemed inspected by invisible eyes, and every house carried the same unspoken rule: fit in or stand out at your own risk. But beneath the polished surface, there was something sharper running through the community, an HOA that didn't just enforce rules but enforced control. At the center of it all was Melissa Grant, the HOA president. Melissa wasn't loud in the traditional sense. She didn't need to be. Her authority came from laminated rulebooks, carefully worded violation notices, and a reputation that had already made most residents think twice before planting a flower too tall or leaving a trash bin out too long. She believed order was everything. In her mind, chaos always started small: an unapproved mailbox here, a slightly off-color fence there, and if not corrected immediately, it spread like rot. And Melissa Grant did not allow rot. Across the street from her carefully maintained home lived a man who didn't seem to care much about any of it. Harold Jenkins, 80 years old, a retired Marine. Harold was the kind of neighbor people noticed but didn't fully know. He kept his lawn neat, but not obsessively so. He waved politely when needed, but never lingered in conversation. His house had a quiet dignity to it, simple, sturdy, and weathered by time rather than trends. Most importantly, he flew an American flag outside his home. Not a decorative one, not a seasonal one. A worn, slightly faded flag that had clearly seen years of sun, wind, and rain. To Harold, it wasn't decoration, it was memory. To Melissa Grant, it was something else. She had noticed it before, she had noted it before, but until now, she had never acted on it. That changed on a Tuesday morning. It started small, like all HOA conflicts did. A routine inspection walk. Melissa walked the street with a clipboard in hand, scanning homes with sharp, practiced eyes. She paused in front of Harold's house longer than usual. Her gaze locked onto the flag, then shifted to the pole, then to the base. A few minutes later, she made a note. Non-compliant exterior display. That was all it took. By afternoon, a formal notice was drafted. By evening, it was printed. By the next morning, it was delivered to Harold Jenkins' front door. The paper was simple, clean, official. But the message inside was anything but simple. It stated that the flag display violated HOA exterior regulations and required immediate removal or modification. Failure to comply would result in escalating fines. Harold read it once. Then again. He didn't react with anger, he didn't storm off or make a scene. Instead, he stood on his porch for a long moment, looking at the flag gently moving in the wind. A neighbor walking by later would say he looked thoughtful, not surprised, just disappointed in a way that came from experience, not emotion. Inside her home, Melissa watched from her window. To her, this was not personal, it was procedural. Rules were rules. If exceptions were made, the entire system would weaken. Still, something about Harold didn't sit entirely right with her. Not enough to stop her, but enough to make her watch a little longer than necessary. That evening, Harold placed the notice on his kitchen table. He didn't crumple it, he didn't throw it away. Instead, he sat down beside it. And for the first time in a long time, he made a phone call. Not to complain. Not to argue. But to ask a question that would quietly set everything in motion. Is this really worth $12,000? On the other end of the line, there was a pause. Because what was coming next was not just another HOA dispute. It was the beginning of a collision neither side would see coming. And in Maplewood Estates, the quiet street was about to become anything but quiet. The morning after the notice was delivered, Maplewood Estates felt the same on the surface. Lawns were watered, sprinklers clicked on schedule, and a jogger passed through the sidewalk as if nothing in the world had changed. But inside Harold Jenkins' home, something had already shifted. He sat at his kitchen table again, the same chair he had used for years, the same worn wood beneath his hands. The notice was still there, but now it was joined by a second document, an official HOA violation summary that had arrived electronically. Harold read it slowly. Then again. The number didn't change, no matter how many times he looked at it. $12,000. It wasn't just a warning anymore. It was a financial penalty stacked across multiple violations, each one listed in cold, bureaucratic language that felt disconnected from reality. Unapproved exterior display. Failure to comply with previous notice. Accumulated enforcement penalties. Harold leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose. He had served in places where decisions were life and death in seconds. But this felt different, not because it was dangerous, but because it was pointless. A flag. A flag he had carried memories under. And now it had a price tag attached to it. Across the street, Melissa Grant was already in motion. She didn't see it as punishment. She saw it as enforcement finally working the way it was supposed to. In her mind, the escalation was justified. The first notice had been ignored or at least not immediately complied with, and that alone triggered the next step. At the HOA office, Melissa sat in a meeting room with two board members, a laptop open in front of her. "We have consistency issues if we back down now," she said firmly. "If one homeowner can ignore notices, everyone will think they can." One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. "It's a veteran, Melissa, 80 years old. That's a pretty steep fine." Melissa didn't flinch. "Age doesn't exempt compliance," she replied. The room went quiet for a moment. Then she added almost dismissively, "If anything, consistency protects everyone equally." By noon, the official fine notice was confirmed and finalized. By afternoon, copies were sent. And by early evening, Harold Jenkins became the most expensive violation case Maplewood Estates had seen in years. When Harold received the updated notice, he didn't speak at first. He simply placed it beside the first one, aligning the edges carefully as if order might somehow make sense of it. Then he stood up, slowly, and walked outside. The street was calm but not empty. A neighbor watering plants noticed him. Another slowed their car slightly. Word had already started to spread, quietly at first, then faster than expected. "Did you hear about the Marine?" someone whispered over a backyard fence. $12,000 for a flag, another replied, shaking their head. But Harold wasn't performing for anyone. He stood on his porch, looking at the flag again, as if weighing something far beyond money. That's when his neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell, from across the street, cautiously approached the edge of her driveway. "Mr. Jenkins," she started carefully, "is everything all right?" Harold gave a small nod. "I've been through worse than paperwork." She hesitated. "Are you going to take it down?" For a moment he didn't answer. Then quietly he said, "No." That single word would have ended the conversation in most neighborhoods. But not here. Because in Maplewood Estates, decisions like that didn't stay private for long. By the time Melissa Grant returned home that evening, her phone was already lighting up with messages from concerned residents. Some questioned the fine. Some supported it. But one message stood out. A resident in the HOA forum had posted a single line. "Are we really fining an 80-year-old Marine $12,000 for a flag?" Melissa stared at it longer than she intended. And for the first time since the process began, something subtle flickered beneath her confidence. Not doubt exactly, but attention. Because once a neighborhood starts asking questions, it rarely stops at one. And somewhere across the street, Harold Jenkins was no longer just a homeowner with a flag. He was becoming something the HOA had not prepared for. A test. By the next morning, Maplewood Estates no longer felt like the same neighborhood it had been just a few days earlier. It wasn't loud, not yet, but something had shifted in the air, subtle like pressure before a storm. People weren't just talking about Harold Jenkins anymore. They were taking positions. It started in small, quiet ways. At first, it was Mrs. Caldwell bringing him an extra loaf of bread by accident. Then Mr. Harris down the street, slowing down his car just to nod in greeting. Then the younger families who normally kept to themselves started asking questions in online neighborhood groups. The story had spread faster than Melissa Grant expected. An 80-year-old Marine, a flag, a $12,000 fine. It sounded less like enforcement now, and more like something unfair when repeated out loud. Inside the HOA office, Melissa stood in front of a digital board meeting screen, arms folded tightly. "This is getting distorted," she said sharply. "People are turning a compliance issue into an emotional narrative." One of the board members cleared his throat. "Melissa, it is emotional. He's a veteran. People are reacting to that." Melissa didn't like that answer. "Inconsistency is what creates chaos," she replied. "If we bend rules for sentiment, we lose control of the community." But control was already slipping. Because outside that office, the neighborhood was no longer neutral. That afternoon, a group chat titled Maplewood Residents exploded with messages. One resident wrote, "Has anyone actually read the HOA rules? This fine seems excessive." Another replied, "It's not about rules anymore, it's about fairness." And then someone posted, "I just spoke to Mr. Jenkins, he didn't even argue, he just looked tired." That message changed something. Not loudly but deeply. By evening, a small group of neighbors gathered near Harold's driveway, not a protest, not a confrontation, just people standing together under the fading light, unsure what they were really doing but unable to ignore it anymore. Harold stood on his porch watching them. He didn't wave them over, he didn't step down immediately. He simply observed, quiet, composed, unreadable. Finally, Mrs. Caldwell spoke up from the edge of the group. "Mr. Jenkins, we're not here to cause trouble. We just wanted to know if you're okay." Harold gave a slow nod. "I've been okay for a long time." A pause followed. Then another neighbor, a younger man in his 30s, spoke carefully. "Do you want help fighting this?" Harold hesitated. Not because he needed help, but because accepting it meant something had changed. Still, he answered honestly. "I don't want to fight," he said. "I just don't understand why it became one." That sentence hung in the air longer than expected. Because no one there had a good answer. Across the street, from behind partially closed blinds, Melissa Grant watched the gathering. Her jaw tightened. To her, this was no longer a simple violation case. It was becoming a challenge to authority itself. The kind of situation HOAs were designed to prevent, but also the kind they feared most when it began spreading socially. That evening, she called an emergency HOA meeting. Her tone was firm, almost urgent. "We are dealing with perception escalation," she said. "Residents are emotionally aligning without understanding the legal framework." One board member looked up, "Or they're just disagreeing with us." The room went quiet. Melissa's expression hardened slightly. "That's why we reinforce structure," she said, "before this spreads further." But it already had. That night, a new discovery surfaced in the neighborhood forum. A resident had been reviewing the HOA bylaws, line by line. And what they found changed the direction of everything. A clause buried deep in the documentation stated that any fine above a certain threshold required documented board approval with recorded justification and a formal vote log. There was only one problem. No one could find that record for Harold Jenkins' case. And suddenly, the conversation wasn't about a flag anymore. It was about something far more serious. Procedure, authority, and whether the system itself had been followed correctly. As messages multiplied and screenshots spread, one thing became clear. The neighborhood was no longer watching quietly. It was starting to investigate. And once a community starts asking how decisions are made, it usually doesn't stop at asking. It starts looking for answers. By the time the sun rose over Maplewood Estates, the situation was no longer a quiet neighborhood dispute. It had turned into something far more volatile. A procedural question had evolved into a credibility crisis. And at the center of it stood one missing record. The HOA meeting room was packed that evening. Board members, a few invited residents, and Melissa Grant at the head of the table with a stack of printed documents arranged with almost obsessive precision. She looked calm, but those who knew her well could see the difference. Her posture was tighter, her tone more controlled, less confident, more defensive. "We are not discussing rumors," she began firmly. "We are discussing compliance enforcement." But the residents weren't there for reassurance anymore. They were there for answers. A man from the neighborhood forum stood up first. "We asked for the approval record for the $12,000 fine. We were told it existed. We still haven't seen it." Melissa didn't hesitate. "It exists in internal archives. Not everything is meant for public interpretation." That response immediately triggered murmurs in the room. Another resident spoke up. "The bylaws say any fine over $10,000 requires documented board approval and a recorded vote. That's not optional." A pause. Then the question that changed the tone of everything. Was there a vote? The room went silent. Melissa's eyes flicked briefly to the board members beside her. One shifted uncomfortably. Another stared down at the table. Finally, she responded. All actions were taken in the interest of community standards enforcement. It wasn't an answer, and everyone knew it. Outside the meeting hall, the tension spilled into the neighborhood. Conversations that once revolved around gardening tips and weekend plans now revolved around governance, authority, and accountability. Some residents still supported Melissa, believing strict enforcement was necessary to maintain order. But others no longer saw order, they saw imbalance. Meanwhile, Harold Jenkins remained mostly out of sight. He didn't attend the meetings, he didn't argue in forums, he didn't escalate emotionally. Instead, he quietly gathered documents of his own. Copies of notices, emails, printed violation records. And one thing more important than all of it, timeline inconsistencies. A retired Marine does not move quickly out of anger. He moves deliberately. Across the street, Melissa noticed something else shifting. Harold wasn't reacting like a typical resident caught in a dispute. There was no desperation, no pleading, no emotional escalation that the HOA usually relied on to control situations. Instead, there was patience. And patience, in her experience, was dangerous. That night, an anonymous post appeared in the neighborhood forum. It contained screenshots, internal HOA notes, and a highlighted excerpt from the bylaws showing the approval requirement for high-value fines. The post ended with a simple question. If the rules weren't followed here, what else wasn't followed? By midnight, the HOA inbox was flooded. Residents demanded documentation, clarification, transparency, and formal review. Melissa called an emergency board session immediately, her voice sharper than before. "This is a coordinated misinformation campaign," she insisted. "We need to regain narrative control." But one board member finally spoke up, hesitating. "Melissa, what if it's not misinformation? What if we just missed a step?" That question landed heavier than any accusation. Because it implied something worse than rebellion. It implied error. And in an HOA built on authority, error was dangerous. Very dangerous. Meanwhile, Harold received a call late that night from Mrs. Caldwell. Her voice was careful. "Mr. Jenkins, things are getting complicated. People are really looking into this now." Harold paused before replying. "I didn't ask them to." "I know," she said softly, "but they're doing it anyway." He looked at the flag outside his window through the glass door. It moved slightly in the night wind. "I just wanted it left alone," he said quietly. But by then, Maplewood Estates had already moved past alone. Because the HOA was no longer just responding. It was reacting. And when systems built on control start to feel questioned, they usually don't tighten calmly. They strike back. And Melissa Grant was about to make a decision that would turn scrutiny into full-blown collapse. The next morning, Maplewood Estates woke up to something it hadn't experienced in years under the current HOA leadership: uncertainty. Not the normal kind of neighborhood gossip uncertainty, but the heavier kind. The kind that spreads when people start realizing documents don't fully match decisions and authority begins to feel less like structure and more like assumption. By 9:00 a.m., the HOA inbox had tripled in volume. By 10:30 a.m., it had become a formal complaint cluster. And by noon, an external review request had been submitted by multiple residents. Melissa Grant sat in her office staring at her screen, her usual composure now replaced with something sharper and more restrained. Not panic. Melissa didn't panic easily, but pressure. Across the table, two board members were already arguing in low voices. "This is getting out of control," one said. "We should release the approval record if it exists." "It does exist," Melissa replied quickly. "It's just not in a format they understand." That sentence landed poorly, because now even the board wasn't fully aligned. And when internal alignment breaks in an HOA, everything becomes vulnerable. Then came the request that changed everything. A formal audit notice from the Regional HOA Oversight Association. It wasn't dramatic, it was simple, clean language, standard procedure. But the implication was enormous. A full review of enforcement actions, documentation, approval records, fine justification history, including the case of Harold Jenkins. Melissa's jaw tightened as she read it. "This is unnecessary escalation," she said. But no one responded with agreement this time. Because by then, something had already surfaced that could not be ignored. During a document reconciliation check initiated by one of the board members, quietly, without Melissa's approval, a discrepancy appeared. The $12,000 fine had been issued under emergency enforcement classification. But there was no recorded emergency justification. No signed authorization. No vote log matching the threshold requirement. And worse, the timestamp on the enforcement entry showed it was finalized before the second violation notice had even been officially delivered to Harold Jenkins. That detail changed everything. It meant the escalation was not procedural progression. It was predetermined enforcement. When the board confronted Melissa with the discrepancy, the room went still. She didn't respond immediately. Not because she didn't have words, but because every possible explanation sounded weaker than the data. Finally, she spoke. "Enforcement authority requires discretion," she said carefully. "If we delay action on obvious violations, we undermine consistency." A board member looked up slowly. "That doesn't answer why the documentation doesn't exist." Silence again. For the first time, Melissa didn't redirect. She didn't deflect. She simply said, "I handled it." That was the moment the shift became irreversible. Because "I handled it" wasn't policy. It was personal authority overriding process. And in that instant, the system stopped seeing her as just a strict administrator. It started seeing her as a liability. Meanwhile, Harold Jenkins received a separate notification that morning, not from the HOA, but from the external review body acknowledging receipt of the complaint. He read it once, then placed it beside the others. He didn't smile, he didn't celebrate. He simply sat down, hands resting quietly on the table, as if waiting for something he already knew was coming. Outside, neighbors were now openly discussing next steps. Not whether the fine was fair anymore, but whether leadership was valid. And that distinction mattered. Because fairness could be debated, but validity could be removed. By late afternoon, an emergency HOA board vote was called. Not initiated by Melissa, but against her. A motion had been introduced to temporarily suspend her authority pending the audit. When she arrived at the meeting room, she immediately realized something had changed. The room was no longer aligned behind her. It was aligned around the process. And she was no longer the center of it. As she stood at the front, looking at the same board members who once followed her directives without question, she finally understood something she had never considered before. Rules only hold power when people agree the person enforcing them is following them too. And now, that agreement was gone. Outside, Harold's flag continued to move gently in the wind. No louder than before. No different than before. But everything around it had changed. And inside the HOA office, the final stage of collapse had already begun.